Thunder rolled like a door slamming on memory. Ava froze as a scream split the rain and died in the alley. She stood in her late father's living room clutching a parcel. A plain brown box had arrived without a note. Ava said, "Who sent this to me?" The tape peeled back and a smell of damp leather rose. Inside lay a cracked diary bound with twine. Her hands shook as lightning bleached the room. A photo slipped free and faced her like an accusation. Ava said, "Dad, what did you hide from me?" The scream outside became sirens fading to a hum. She opened the first page and saw a name she knew from the news. Her pulse climbed the stairs of her throat. Ink had bled in places like tears. A final line scrawled across the margin begged forgiveness. Ava said, "This can't be real." Rain battered the windows like fists. The house seemed to lean closer, listening. The diary waited, heavy as a verdict. The sirens thinned to silence and left a hush so sharp it felt like glass. Ava traced the circled name as if it could cut her. She remembered headlines and smiling lies. Ava said, "You were always the hero, weren't you?" Her father's chair stood empty like a witness who refused the oath. The diary smelled of mold and aftershave. A pressed flower cracked into crumbs under the crease. "Ah," Ava said, "if you wrote this, then you wanted me to see it." A clock on the mantel counted louder with each second. Rain drummed a rhythm that sounded like a warning. A floorboard answered with a long, dry sigh. The first entry shifted from dates to confessions. Ink swerved into a plea that stained the page like a bruise. Ava said, "Tell me everything, even if it hurts." She turned the page as if lifting a stone. The house settled around her like a closing fist. The next page bore a photograph glued crooked to the paper. It showed her father beside the celebrated official in a room heavy with flags. Ava said, "Why were you there?" A caption in shaky ink named a date she had feared. A rumor from her childhood clicked into place. The scream outside now felt like an echo rising from the past. Ava said, "You kept this because you could not speak it." The diary stuttered into lists of places and payments. Each line felt like a door slamming shut. Her mouth went dry like paper. She heard the drip of water somewhere deeper in the house. Ava said, "Who else knew?" A page edge cut her thumb and a bead of red marked the margin. She did not wipe it away. The clock ticked as if it were counting witnesses. A gust rattled the window and sent a cold breath across the room. Ava lifted the diary to the lamp and watched the water-warped page shimmer. A hidden note slipped from the back cover. Ava said, "No, not more." It was a receipt with an address she knew only from scandal. The date matched the week her family stopped smiling in photos. Ava said, "You were there that night." Her heartbeat counted off the facts she could not deny. She pictured her father at the edge of a room full of suits. The receipt's ink had bled into the fibers like a confession. The house creaked as if it wanted to correct her. Ava said, "I need proof that breathes." She grabbed her coat from the chair and listened for footsteps that were not there. The rain eased, but the street still hissed. The door chain slid back with a metallic whisper. Ava stepped into the stairwell, and the air smelled of wet concrete and old paint. She locked the door and gripped the diary like a shield. Ava said, "If you buried me in lies, I will dig you out." The scream's memory pulled her downward. A neighbor's hall light buzzed and then steadied. She moved past peeling numbers and a wilted plant. The city hummed like a distant engine. Ava said, "This starts tonight." She thought of the official's perfect smile and her father's quiet hands. The two images fought behind her eyes. She held the book tighter and felt its heat. A drop of rain tapped her wrist through the rail's rust. The night opened like a wound and waited. Morning softened the storm's bruise, but Ava carried the night inside her. She arrived at the public school early and unlocked her classroom with careful hands. Posters curled at the corners like shy smiles. "Me," Ava said, Okay, little stars, we try again today. A boy with a torn backpack hovered at the door and hid his homework behind his sleeve. Ava knelt so their eyes met, and the fear in him unclenched. Ava said, "You did your best, and that counts." The diary's weight pressed between her ribs like a secret bell. She heard the distant name from its pages every time the intercom crackled. The principal hurried past without seeing her. Ava said, "It's fine," though it was not. She taped a paper sun to the window and let light find it. She had given her patience to 100 small fires and kept none for herself. Ava said, "We will read about brave choices," and opened a book. The room breathed with her. On her break, Ava sat on the back steps and watched puddles stitch the sky to the asphalt. A lunch she could barely taste sat unopened beside her. Ava said money later, heart now, and checked her inbox. Bills stacked like teeth. A scholarship form for a student blinked unanswered. She remembered a childhood kitchen where whispers replaced music. Ava said, "You told me not to ask," and the words felt young in her mouth. The diary had cracked that silence and let weather in. She scrolled past the official's headline and felt the screen grow cold. A memory of her father's hands over hers trying to teach her patience rose and faded. "Whoa," Ava said, "I learned too well." She clicked through forms for her students as if stitching a torn net. The bell rang and she stood, steady again, because children do not wait for grief to make sense. After class, Ava crossed town to a community center where the hall smelled of floor, wax, and hope. A teen waited with eyes that had learned to scan exits. Ava said, "You're not in trouble. You're in a story that can change." The teen's mother sat rigid as a broom and feared every question. Ava asked about schedules, sleep, and a ride to tomorrow. She wrote numbers on a card and slid it across like a bridge. A muted television showed the official shaking hands on a podium. Ava's throat tightened until it sang. Ava said, "We focus on you now," and turned the screen to the wall. She gathered consent forms and careful promises. The mother's grip softened. The teen laughed once, surprised by the sound. Ava said that's the start, and believed it because she had to. She left with their names and a task she would not drop. Dusk found Ava at a small cafe where steam drew ghosts on the windows. Lena arrived late and carried a smile that worked too hard. Lena said, "You look like you slept in thunder." Ava laughed once and let it break. Ava said a package came last night. It was his diary. Lena's hand paused above the cup and did not land. The hum of other tables turned into foam. Lena said, "Are you sure it's his?" Ava nodded and watched a crack in the sugar jar catch light. She described the names and the dates, and her father's apology. Lena said, "Maybe it's not what it seems," and her voice was soft but stiff. Ava felt the table tilt toward questions. She listed the receipts and the address that hurt to speak. Lena changed the subject and asked about school. Ava said, "They're fine," and tasted the lie. Night folded the city and laid it on Ava's shoulders as she climbed the stairs home. The building smelled of rain, metal, and someone else's dinner. In her living room, the lamp made a small country of light. Ava said, "I help everyone but the girl I used to be." She placed the diary on the table like a map and traced the roots of damage. She listed the students who would need rides and letters tomorrow. Duty and Fury shared a chair. Ava said, "I can carry both," though the weight argued. The official's face looked out from the photo and offered nothing. She pictured her father's silence and felt how it had trained her. Ava said no more quiet. She wrote 3 names on a card: the address, the archivist, and Lena. She slid the card into her pocket and let the house exhale. Dawn bleached the riverfront to a tired gray as Ava reached the address. The warehouse sagged behind a chain-link fence and smelled of bleach and tide. Ava said, "You hid here and checked the receipt again." A side door hung on a rusted hinge like a bad secret. She slipped inside and let her eyes learn the dark. Pallets crouched like animals, and a loading scale blinked a lone red dot. A clipboard listed deliveries on the date she feared. Her father's initials shadowed a line marked Consult. Ava said, "You signed it." A mop bucket squeaked, and a janitor stepped from the gloom. The janitor said, "No photos in here." Ava held the clipboard long enough to read a shell company. Ava said, "Public records, right?" A camera clicked above them, and a car idled outside. The janitor said, "Walk away," and the words carried someone else's breath. The city archives opened with the creak of faithful hinges. Dust floated like patient witnesses above the tables. Mr. Calder wore a cardigan and a frown that had seen too much. Mr. Calder said, "What are we chasing today?" Ava laid the diary and the receipt between them. Ava said, "A paper trail that pretends to be clean." He rolled the microfilm until the night unspooled in pale ribbons. A ledger listed venue fees paid by a shell that matched her clipboard line. Mr. Calder said, "Records vanish when names get large." A second entry labeled her father as consultant for logistics. "How?" Ava said. He opened the door they needed. A transfer note fed money back to the officials committee. Mr. Calder said, "You sure you want to keep reading?" Ava did not answer because the truth had started answering for her. Outside the archives, the day felt thinner than it should. A black sedan idled half a block away, like a period waiting to drop. Ava said, "Not today," and turned down a narrow street. Her phone buzzed with a number that wore no name. "Unknown," said, "Stop digging, or you will drown in it." The call ended before fear could finish its sentence. She ducked into the transit station and watched reflections fracture. A security camera swung as if choosing a side. Ava said, "You do not get to decide," and forced her breath to match the crowd. She changed platforms twice and bought a ticket she would not use. The sedan passed the entrance and melted into traffic. "I wanted to always say 20 Muis, all Nui." Her hands steadied because the work needed steady hands. She typed the number into a new file and saved it under the word pressure. The address on the birth record led to a walk-up smelling of tea and dust. Aunt Mara opened the door, wearing grief like a shawl she refused to fold. Aunt Mara said, "You look like your mother when she decided things." Ava set the diary on the table and did not sit. Ava said, "I need the piece you kept to protect me." A drawer produced a faded envelope with her name in her mother's hand. Inside lay a baptism card with the official listed as a witness. Aunt Mara said he promised scholarships and peace. A clipped article about a fundraiser matched the receipt date. Ava said, "What did Dad trade for quiet?" Aunt Mara's voice shook but did not break. Aunt Mara said, "He took money to bury an accident that was not his fault." The sentence stained the room like smoke that refused to leave. Night took the city back and left edges where comfort used to be. Ava's lock grated as if it had learned a new language. The living room wore the signs of a careful storm. Drawers sat open like questions. No one answered. Ava said, "You were thorough," and checked the diary's hiding place. The pages lay scattered, but her phone held their ghosts. A matchbook from the donor club gleamed on the table like a grin. Inside, a note said, "We see you." Ava said, "Then see me work," and photographed everything twice. She texted Lena a simple line about a break-in. Lena replied too quickly and begged her to come over. Ava slipped a card with 3 names deeper into her pocket. The street below hummed like a wire ready to snap. Night draped the city in wet velvet as Ava climbed to Lena's door. The hallway buzzed with a tired light that made everything confess. Lena opened with a smile that did not touch her eyes. Lena said, "You look wrecked." Ava stepped inside and set the diary down. Ava said, "Someone tossed my place." Lena's gaze fell to the twine and stayed too long. A kettle hissed like a warning. Ava said, "Tell me what you have been swallowing." Lena poured tea and missed the cup by a breath. Lena said, "You should rest." Ava slid the receipt and baptism card across the table. Ava said, "I need a name and a reason." The rain tapped the glass in quick, guilty syllables. Lena's shoulders folded like a bridge under weight. Lena said, "If I talk, they will ruin you." Ava said, silence already did. Ava laid the photocopies like cards dealt by a ruthless dealer. She pointed to the ledger, the receipt, and the baptism witness line. Ava said, these pieces meet in one room. Lena's phone lit and turned face down. Lena said, please stop before it bites back. Ava opened the diary to the apology stained like smoke. Ava said, he wrote this to me. Lena rubbed her temples, as if smoothing years. Lena said, your father asked me to keep you away. Ava stared at her and felt the room move. Ava said, you had the envelope first. Lena flinched and nodded once. Lena said, I held it when your mother got sick. Ava heard the hallway light buzz like a fly that would not die. Ava said, you kept me in the dark because it suited them. Lena exhaled and let the mask lie where it fell. Lena said, there was an accident at the fundraiser. She looked at the floor as if the scene played there. Lena said, a donor's son hit a staffer with a car. Ava felt the words bruise her ribs. Lena said, your father moved people, hid keys, and took their money. Ava closed her eyes and saw the loading bay. Lena said, he thought he was saving you and your mother. Ava tasted iron and knew it was old rage. Lena said, they promised tuition for your kids at school. Ava laughed once, and it cut. Ava said, my work is not a receipt. Lena said, I believed them and I kept you quiet. The confession settled like ash on a white tablecloth. Ava said, you chose them over me. Ava's voice trimmed itself to the bone. Ava said, did you warn them about me? Lena stared at the dark phone and did not answer. Ava tapped the matchbook photo on her screen. Ava said they were inside my home. Lena's hand shook and found the table edge. Lena said, I tried to slow you so they wouldn't panic. Ava felt the floor tilt toward a drop. Ava said, you fed a storm and called it kindness. Lena reached for her wrist and stopped. Lena said, I was scared they would end your work. Ava steadied her breath and set her phone to record. Ava said, say their names. The rain thinned until it sounded like static. Lena said, committee staff, donors, the driver, and the man you think is clean. The confession hung between them like a wire that hummed with heat. Ava picked up the diary and felt its weight beside her. Ava said, I will not keep your secret for them. Lena folded into the chair as if gravity chose sides. Lena said, if this goes public, they will come for you. Ava's voice did not rise. Ava said, let them come to the light. She slid a copy of the recording to the cloud and watched the bar climb. Ava said, you can help or you can watch. Lena closed her eyes and nodded once. Lena said, there are emails in a private folder. Ava stood and the room seemed smaller than truth. Ava said, send them tonight. The hallway light buzzed as she left and sounded almost new. Dawn thinned the clouds to a patient gray as Ava reached the public library's side door. She carried the diary in a tote like contraband. Rafi waited at a study table and closed his laptop. Rafi said, you sure you want your name on this? Ava set copies down and met his eyes. Ava said, I am done borrowing silence. He scanned ledgers, receipts, and the baptism card. Rafi said, this ties the fundraiser to the shell. She slid her phone across and opened the recording. Ava said, Lena, names, committee staff, and the driver. He nodded and drew a timeline in neat blocks. Rafi said, town hall at noon, the official on stage. Ava felt the old fear reach for her throat and miss. Ava said, I will ask him in public. He warned her about security and traps that smile. Rafi said, send me the full dump now. She hit upload and watched the bar move like a fuse. The hotel ballroom glittered like a promise with a price tag. Volunteers pinned name badges with smiles that rang hollow. Ava stood at the question mic and counted breaths. The official strode in with cameras, nipping at his heels. Ava said, my question concerns a fundraiser accident and a cover-up. Heads turned as if pulled by wire. The official said, We welcome tough questions, and showed 30 teeth. Ava named the shell company and the receipt date. The official said, those records are misread by bad actors. She felt the room tighten and would not step back. Ava said, my father was your consultant that night. The official blinked and reset his smile. Security drifted closer like polite shadows. Ava said, will you confirm the driver and the payback to your committee? A handler touched her elbow and invited her backstage. The corridor smelled of coffee, toner, and fresh paint. The official stood under a humming exit sign. The official said, you are brave and very misinformed. Ava lifted her phone where red light glowed. Ava said, then correct me on record. He stepped closer and offered concern like candy. The official said, you help children, I can help more if we partner. She heard the bribe wearing a soft coat. Ava said, a donor's son hit a staffer, and you bought silence. He glanced at the camera and let disdain breathe. The official said, gossip ruins good people. She named the ledger lines and the committee transfer. He exhaled a single word that sounded like yes and no at once. The hallway seemed to lean and listen. Lena's email arrived with a ping that cut the air. It carried threads of schedules, memos, and a draft apology. Ava tapped Rafi and opened a live stream with shaking hands that steadied. Ava said, I am Ava, and this is what happened. The chat blazed like a fuse racing uphill. She read the shell payments and named the driver's family. The official's comms director rushed in with a practiced frown. The comms director said, we will address these falsehoods later. Ava scrolled to the ledger and spoke dates like verdicts. She uploaded the corridor audio and let the crowd hear his evasion. Ava said, I choose my students and the truth. A guard reached for her phone and hesitated at the lens. Rafi texted that the dump had gone to 3 desks and counting. Sirens braided with applause and anger outside the hotel doors. Reporters gathered like weather. Ava stepped into the wind and felt the city look back. A man from the ethics office showed a badge with tired eyes. The agent said, if you have originals, we can secure them now. Ava handed the diary to a sealed bag and kept the scans. Ava said, I will testify on record. The official exited to a storm of microphones he could not choreograph. He said words about unity that fit nothing. Ava met his gaze and did not flinch. Rafi whispered that 2 outlets had published. Rafi said, the recording is already mirrored. Ava nodded and chose the risk with both hands. The crowd shifted and made a path she did not expect. Morning laid a clean edge on the city as Ava entered the ethics office. The conference room smelled of paper and ozone. The agent set out a chain of custody form like a runway. The agent said, we log every transfer. Ava passed the copies and kept her calm like a craft. Rafi opened a spreadsheet that mapped nights to names. Rafi said, these emails align with the ledger flow. Ava watched the red light on the recorder and did not blink. Ava said the driver's name is here, and so is the committee link. The agent nodded and slid an evidence bag across. The agent said, we will subpoena the rest today. A clerk brought coffee that no one touched. Ava said, I will testify, and I will not recant. The room held the words and let the past come in only as evidence. By noon the board convened under the bright echo of cameras. Reporters waited like gulls along a pier of microphones. The chair read findings that cracked the air. The chair said, we recommend suspension pending inquiry. Ava felt the city exhale through its teeth. Mr. Calder stood with his ledgers and quiet hands. Mr. Calder said, these records were altered post-event. The official's lawyer offered a statement built to slide. The lawyer said, our client welcomes transparency. Rafi texted that 2 committee staff had flipped. Ava said, then more truth is coming, and faced the steps. She answered 3 questions and declined the trap of a 4th. The door behind her closed on the echo of a career unraveling. Afternoon brought Ava back to the classroom that knew her real name. Paper suns trembled in the vent's small wind. A girl raised a hand and did not ask about headlines. The girl said, "Can we still do the reading circle?" Ava smiled and let her shoulders remember home. Ava said yes, and today we read about telling the truth kindly. She moved through phonics and small victories like a healer. A parent at the door pressed a note that thanked her for courage. Ava said, "We do this work together," and meant it. An email arrived granting her whistleblower protections. Rafi said in a text, "You have cover to keep teaching." Ava leaned on the desk and felt the ground hold. Dusk found Ava by the river where the warehouse shadow thinned. Lena stood with a scarf pulled tight as if it could hold time. Lena said, "I turned over everything, including the donor call logs." Ava looked at the current and let anger pass like drift. Ava said, "Thank you, and I will not lie for you in memory." Lena nodded and took the sentence like medicine. Lena said, "I am ready for what follows." Ava eyed the sky that finally forgot the storm. Ava said, "We can speak again when the victims have air." Lena's voice broke and then held. Lena said, "I hope you find a lighter name for your father." Ava tucked her hands into her coat and chose not to answer that wish. Night gathered at the loading bay where the first lie was parked. Candles marked a small vigil for the staffer who lost his path. Aunt Mara stood with a paper cup and gentle eyes. Aunt Mara said, "He deserved a clean truth." Ava stepped forward and named the man aloud. Ava said, "We say his name and the cost that followed." Rafi handed her a flyer for a scholarship fund. Rafi said, "We launch it tomorrow with the union." Ava felt the diary's gravity turn into motion she could carry. Ava said, "Let this money speak where power once pressed mute." A breeze lifted the smoke and did not send it back. The city listened without interruption for the first time. Morning unfolded like a clean page as the community gathered at the gym. Folding chairs clicked into rows that felt like resolve. Ava said, "We name the scholarship for the worker we failed." Rafi lifted a banner that did not waver. Rafi said, "Applications open today for students who hold others up." Aunt Mara pressed a program into Ava's hand and squeezed once. Aunt Mara said, "Grief can plant things too." Reporters hovered but did not steer the room. Ava read the first award criteria and felt the hush lean closer. Ava said, "Service before spotlight, truth before ease." The applause rose and settled like a promise that would keep returning. By noon, the courthouse steps swelled with news that did not blink. The chair announced formal charges, and a resignation letter shaped like smoke. The chair said, "Obstruction and conspiracy will be tried in full." Ava stood at the curb and let the words pass through. Ava said, "Accountability is a door, not a wall." Mr. Calder nodded once, ledger tucked under his arm like a flag. Mr. Calder said, "The record kept speaking." Cameras swung toward the building and then away from her. Rafi handed Ava a printout showing the fund already seeded. "And," Rafi said, "small donations, all with notes that sound like courage." The air felt plain and honest, and it was enough. Evening softened to amber when Lena arrived at the river cafe. She carried a small box that looked heavy with air. Lena said, "These are the keys I kept for them and for fear." Ava listened and did not rush the silence. Ava said, "I will deliver them to the investigators." Lena's mouth trembled and then steadied. Lena said, "I will testify and say my part without varnish." The city hummed like a better machine. Ava said, "We are not friends today, but we are not enemies." Lena accepted the boundary like a true map. Lena said, "I hope your work stays louder than my apology." They parted with a nod that honored the weight of both choices. The next day, the classroom held a mural bright enough to defy weather. Children painted hands that reached for one another without asking permission. A A boy said, "Is telling the truth brave if it scares you?" Ava smiled and rinsed a brush until the water cleared. Ava said, "Fear and courage walk together, and courage keeps going." Her parent left cupcakes and a note with quiet thanks. Ava said, "We celebrate effort, not noise." The intercom clicked and stayed mercifully dull. She taped a photo of the scholarship banner beside the reading chart. Ava said, "This is where power belongs." The room breathed, like a small and permanent sunrise. Night arrived clear and quiet, and the river wore stars like steady pins. Ava walked the footbridge with the diary's copies, sealed and filed. She paused where the city's noise softened to truth. Ava said, "I am not what you hid, and I am not what you feared." Wind lifted her hair and set it down without taking anything. She texted Rafi 3 words that needed no reply. Ava said, "We keep going." Across the water, the warehouse lights were off, and would stay that way. She breathed without counting, and felt space return to her ribs. The path ahead did not ask for permission, only steps. She took them,